Hey everybody, welcome to the video. So we're going my first look for week 8 of the NFL season over on Draftkings. Also have my favorite high-end targets, mid-range plays, and value plays videos posted once again this week, in addition to some showdown content, my lineup building video, and my core plays video as well. So just the usual stuff that I post pretty much each and every single week. Also, if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like on the video, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. I really do appreciate it. And without further ado, let's dive right into it. So we'll start with the quarterback position, and up top we have Patrick Mahomes at a massive $8,100 price tag. And my first thoughts here is that he's only in play for tournaments for me because, look, he's a very athletic quarterback, but he doesn't run the ball like someone like Kyler Murray or Lamar Jackson does. So you don't have that super high floor out of him that those guys offer. He's still absolutely excellent, but last week we saw they blew out the Denver Broncos, and Patrick Mahomes came out of the game early, and he certainly did not hit value within his price tag, and the price went up here, and they're nearly 20-point favorites at home versus the Jets. So I do have concerns there. I don't think this game is going to stay too competitive, and when I spend it for the quarterback position, I want someone that's going to be in a competitive game. Like, for example, Russell Wilson last week, he was around $8,000. That game was expected to be competitive, and it was, and he still had a very strong game. Kyler Murray was also expensive, and you expect it to be a competitive game, and he also offers you that rushing upside. So I'd be more compelled to spend up for a quarterback that's going to be in a back-and-forth high-scoring game, whereas I think this game, it's just going to be mainly the Chiefs here, and they could end up running the ball more, or maybe they just even take Patrick Mahomes out. So those are the kind of the risks you have here with Patrick Mahomes, and again, it's going to take a lot of money take a lot of points for him to hit value. And I definitely think guys like Cam Newton, Derek Carr, even Baker Mayfield, Joe Burrow can put a better point per dollar performances. So I think Mahomes is better served for tournaments because there's a ton of upside here. Because if by somehow, some way the Jets stay competitive in this game, Patrick Mahomes is going to have a huge outing. Like, we're talking like 300 plus yards, probably 4 to 5 touchdowns. But I think those chances are pretty slim here, and I don't think we're going to see an absolute ceiling game out of Mahomes. And even then, I think these guys could beat him at point per dollar wise. But I like him in tournaments. Just I don't think there's a reason to go there in cash games. And if you pay up for him, you're probably sacrificing a high-end running back this week, which I'd feel much more comfortable spending up the running back position than I would at the quarterback position. But good matchup versus the Jets. They're 20th DV versus the pass. It's a lot of money to pay up for a quarterback in what should be a pretty lopsided game. Now, Aaron Rodgers, 7,600. The Packers had a big bounce back week last week versus the Texans, which I kind of thought would be the case, and as did most people. But, man, Rodgers had a great game. Davante Adams had a huge game, had nearly 200 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, had nearly 50 Draftkings points, which was looking like it was going to be the best performance of the week, but Tyler Lockett decided to get 56 points. So, one up Davante Adams there. But, yeah, fantastic game for Rodgers and the Packers offense. They'll probably get Aaron Jones back this week, which doesn't really affect too much for Aaron Rodgers. It just gives him another weapon on the offense, which is already a very good offense. And I expect to have a pretty good game here versus the Minnesota Vikings. They have a 30.5 implied team total this week, a 54.5 point over-under, and a 7-point spread, which it's a little lopsided, but it's certainly not 20 points like the Jets and Kansas City Chiefs game. So I'm not too concerned there. And like I mentioned, this is a great matchup versus the Minnesota Vikings, one of the worst defenses in the league this season. They're 15 DVA versus the pass, but giving up 24.4 DraftKings points per game to the quarterback position, which is 27th in the league. Nearly 300 passing yards per game and 2.33 passing touchdowns as well. So Rodgers, he's a bit pricey, but I do like him in tournaments. Probably won't get there in cash games just because I like to spend down a little bit for quarterbacks unless we have someone like Kyler Murray on the slate, because he's been in a nice price range for most of the year. He's been in that like mid 6K to around the 7K range, and with his rushing ability, it's making him a pretty easy play most weeks. I expect after he comes out of the bye week, he'll probably end up being pretty expensive, but either way, I got sidetracked there. I forget why I brought up Kyler Murray, but Aaron Rodgers, I do like him in tournaments. Probably not the best cash game play just because he's $7,600, and I think there's some better point per dollar options here, but a good play nonetheless. Now, Ryan Tannehill at $6,800. I think we're going to have a pretty big Derrick Henry week, but that's not to say that Ryan Tannehill can have a good game either. And the last time this happened, they were actually playing versus the Texans, and they were all pretty cheap. Ryan Tannehill was below 6K, A.J. Brown was below 6K, Derrick Henry was in the low 7K range. But now this week, these guys are all priced up, so it's not that easy to do a triple stack if you want. Tannehill's nearly $7,000. Derrick Henry, I believe, is around $8,000. A.J. Brown's close to $7,000, so it's not as easy to stack this team up like it was that week. But this is a great spot versus Cincy. This is a team that allowed Baker Mayfield to pretty much complete, 22 passes in a row last week and throw 5 touchdowns, which is absolutely insane. Not saying that's going to happen again. But Ryan Tannehill, he's been good since week 7 last year. Like, ever since then, he has been putting up pretty strong fantasy performances almost each and every single week. He's been one of the higher rated quarterbacks in the league since then as well, according to PFF. And You got to like the Titans here quite a bit, and I actually like this game a lot for fantasy purposes. We got a 54.5 point over-under, and there's a lot of good fantasy options here. You got Ryan Tannehill, Derrick Henry, Jonnu Smith, A.J. Brown. On the flip side, you got Joe Burrow, A.J. Green, T. Higgins, either Joe Mixon or Giovanni Bernard, whoever is going to be playing. And you got some other good options as well, like Tyler Boyd. So yeah, I think this is going to be a really good game for fantasy purposes. But if we're looking at the numbers here for Tannehill so far this season, 2.5 passing touchdowns per game, around 265 passing yards per game, 112 QBR rating, which is actually right below Aaron Rodgers. This just goes to show how good Ryan Tannehill has been the past pretty much season now, since we just went through week 7. So yeah, pretty much like a full season. In the matchup versus Cincy, it's pretty good. They're actually mid-pack versus quarterbacks, but they're 26 DVOA versus the pass, and allowing 21.2 DraftKings points per game. But they just got lit up by Baker Mayfield without Odell Beckham Jr. last week, so this is definitely a beatable defense. I think Ryan Tannehill is certainly in play. I just wish he was a bit cheaper, because I got to be honest, it doesn't feel great paying $7,000 for Ryan Tannehill, but he has been pretty good. And they have a pretty high implied team total this week as well at 30 points. Now, on the flip side of this game, we have Joe Burrow at 6,200, who he looks phenomenal. I think the guy's going to be the absolute real deal, which is not a hot take. He was taken first overall for a reason, was great in college, but he looks fantastic. The only problem is the Bengals can't get the guy wins. Poor guy. But he's playing well, and they're throwing the ball quite a bit. And this is a good matchup through the air versus Tennessee. Burrow's averaging nearly 300 passing yards per game. Less than 1.5 passing touchdowns per game, but still, they're throwing the ball over 40 times per game right now. And he actually has some rushing ability, and he had a couple of QB sneaks versus the Browns as well. But this is a good matchup versus Tennessee. They're 19th DVA versus the pass. They're 23rd in DraftKings points per game given up to the quarterback position. Nearly 300 passing yards per game allowed and 2.5 passing touchdowns. So yeah, I like Joe Burrow at 6,200. It's very easy to stack him with his weapons. With Tyler Boyd, A.J. Green, and T. Higgins, they're pretty cheap for the most part. And with them being 6-point dogs here, I expect them to be passing the ball quite a bit, which they've done pretty much this season quite a bit. So yeah, I do like Joe Burrow at $6,200. Then Baker Mayfield, 6,100. I love the Cleveland-Las Vegas game for fantasy purposes. Probably my favorite game of the week because these guys are all affordable for the most part. And then I think there's going to be a lot of points scored here. You have two decent offenses. Well, I say the Browns' offense is better than the Raiders. They've been putting up more points so far this season. The Raiders is still fine. Derek Carr's been playing better than we'd expected him to. But these defenses suck for the most part. They give up quite a bit of points. So I love this game for fantasy purposes. We got a 53.5 point over-under, 28-point implied team total for the Browns, and they're only 2.5-point favorites, which means this should be a pretty back-and-forth game. And when I saw this game on the schedule, I was like, this is probably going to be a pretty good game for fantasy purposes. And I guess Vegas would agree here with that tight spread. Should be pretty back and forth. Cleveland's playing at home. I like Baker Mayfield here. Now, I'm not just chasing the 5-touchdown game that he had last week, but something clicked with him after where did he go? He started 0 for 5 with a pick, but unfortunately got Odell hurt. Ever since then, the only pass he missed was that spike, and if you don't count that, he didn't miss after that, really, unless I'm missing a pass somewhere. But he was absolutely phenomenal through the game-winning touchdown to Peoples-Jones at the end. He looked pretty darn good, and I hate to say it, this is no slight to Odell, but they just don't have the best chemistry, and it sounds crazy to say, but Odell being out might, in a weird way, help Baker Mayfield out, because I feel like Baker tries to force-feed Odell the ball to keep him happy, and with Odell gone, Baker looked a lot more comfortable, and I don't think he's going to have to feel like he's got to force-feed the superstar wide receiver. He can just go to who's open, and I got to be honest, like, it sounds weird to say, but I feel like that might help him in some weird way, and there's a lot of good options on this offense. You got Jarvis Landry, obviously, Kareem Hunt, probably no Austin Hooper, but Harrison Bryant, David Njoku filled his shoes nicely. Peoples-Jones on the outside, the wide receiver from Michigan. And you also have Rashard Higgins, who he has very good chemistry with. So I think Baker's going to be fine with that Odell, and $6,100 versus Las Vegas. You can probably sign me up for that. Now, I like Derek Carr on the flip side, probably a little bit better at $5,500, but this is a soft matchup versus the Raiders. They're 29th DVA versus the pass, 28th versus quarterbacks this season, nearly 300 passing yards per game. So Mayfield is certainly on my radar. Cam Newton at 5,700 had one of the worst games of the season last week, ended up getting benched for Stidham. And it was very, very ugly for Cam. I mean, the guy just played absolutely awful. Now, Bill Belichick made sure that everyone knew that he's going to be the starting quarterback this week. But if he keeps playing like that, like Cam said, it could potentially be a permanent change. And I can't imagine Cam Newton's going to play that bad again, especially, I mean, you don't want to get benched. It absolutely sucks getting benched. So I expect him to be fully focused here. He should have at least somewhat of a bounce-back game. The matchup versus the Bills, I wouldn't say it's my favorite matchup in the world. They're kind of mid-pack versus the pass. 18th DVA versus that, and exactly mid-pack versus quarterbacks this season. But I'm mostly interested in the rushing upside with Cam Newton. Now, I didn't really show that last week, but averaging over 8 rushing attempts per game, a rushing touchdown per game, nearly 50 rushing yards per game, doesn't really do much to the air. I mean, only less than 200 passing yards per game, but the rushing upside's there. Buffalo's actually not that good versus the run. We saw that on Monday Night Football when the Chiefs used Clyde Edwards-Helaire and just absolutely ran down their throats all game. I know he's not a running back, but at only $5,700, he's certainly interesting. Now, what could be my favorite quarterback of the week, especially with this price tag, Derek Carr, $5,500. It's going to be hard not to play Derek Carr here because that's just a little bit too cheap for a matchup versus Cleveland's. Cleveland's defense, outside of Denzel Ward and Myles Garrett, it's pretty rough. There's a couple of okay players there, but they're not a good defense. Joe Burrow lit them up last week, and they just tend to get in shootouts each and every single week. Fortunately, now that the Browns' offense is competent, they can put up points and help them out, but yeah, their defense is pretty rough, and Derek Carr's playing well. He's averaging nearly 300 passing yards per game, 35 pass attempts per game, yards per attempt of 8.2, which is tied for the most of all the quarterbacks we have listed here. 72% completion percentage, and like I said, Cleveland, they're not that good versus the pass, allowing over 300 passing yards per game, over 2 passing touchdowns per game, and their 25th DVA versus the pass. So at $5,500 and a very high over/under 53.5, 2.5 point dogs on the road. I like Derek Carr a lot, and I think that's an excellent cash game quarterback play because it's going to allow you to spend up at wide receiver and a running back this week if you're only playing a $5,500 for a quarterback position. So I like Derek Carr a ton here. Jimmy G, I would rather just play Derek Carr, but I had to list him here just because he's going up against Seattle, and Seattle just is so bad versus quarterbacks. They give up points each and every single week. I know Jimmy G's numbers are not that good. He's going to be without Deebo Samuel this week, but Seattle sucks versus the pass. They really do. 30th DVOA versus that. I mean, the second most points per game to the position. And these numbers don't seem real, but they're allowing nearly 400 passing yards per game. Nearly 400 passing yards. That's absolutely insane, astronomical numbers. So Jimmy G, if he has a somewhat okay day for $5,400, he should be fine. I'd expect him to probably throw a couple of touchdowns here, get over 200 passing yards, and that's okay, $5,400. But I would prefer Derek Carr for only $100 more, which should be a pretty competitive game back and forth, and I think a lot of points are going to be scored there. And Derek Carr has actually been pretty decent so far to start this season. And then after the hour of talking about quarterbacks, it felt like we'll move on to their running back position. And up top, we have Derrick Henry, who's $8,000 here. Like the matchup versus Cincinnati, they're 6-point favorites on the road, 30.25 applied team total. And I would expect the Titans to be able to handle the Bengals pretty well, and they should be able to rely on the run for most of this game. And we know Henry's upside. The guy has, we saw it versus Jacksonville, versus Houston, where he had about around 200 yards and a couple of touchdowns. That's the kind of upside that Derrick Henry has. Isn't a huge threat in the passing game. He doesn't really need to with the volume he gets on the ground. We should expect around 25 to 30 touches here for him. It's a good matchup versus Cincinnati. Their 21st DVA versus the run. Now, they're actually allowing the 12th fewest points per game to the running back position, but over 100 rushing yards per game. They're just not really giving up many rushing touchdowns, but Derrick Henry, he's a different kind of human. He's huge, he's large, he's super fast, and it's hard to tackle him, especially as the game goes on. And also, he plays better as the year goes on, and we're starting to creep up around the midpoint of the season, and I think Derrick Henry probably has a pretty strong game here versus Cincinnati. So if you can afford him, definitely like Derrick Henry. Dalvin Cook, we should expect him to be back from injury, and hopefully, because Alexander Mattison was awful the last time that the Vikings were actually playing football. They had the bye week last week, but Mattison was horrendous versus Atlanta. And he is certainly not the talent that Dalvin Cook is. But this is a good spot versus Green Bay. They've actually been one of the worst run defenses in the entire league. Looking at their numbers this season, they're actually giving up the most points per game to the running back position with 34.5 Draftkings points per game, or 94 rushing yards per game, over a rushing touchdown. And the thing is, they're getting killed through the air by running backs. Over 7 catches per game, over 60 receiving yards per game, and half a receiving touchdown per game allowed as well. So yeah, I like the spot for Dalvin Cook. He's a good pass catcher. He's great on the ground. I mean, over 5 yards per carry this season, nearly 1.5 rushing touchdowns per game, nearly 20 rushing attempts per game, and around 100 rushing yards. So Dalvin Cook, really good spot for him. And if the Vikings want to win, they're going to have to keep the ball out of Aaron Rodgers' hands as much as possible and probably try to kill the clock with Dalvin Cook for the most part. So I like him as long as he's good to go in practice this week and fully good to go for Sunday. Aaron Jones, $7,300. He was another guy that was hurt the last game that he played, although it sounded like he was going to be good to go. But the Packers, they've been very strict on their injuries this season. We saw that with Devontae Adams early on, where he felt like he could play and he wanted to play, but they just would not let him. And I guess it's for the best. And we saw that with Aaron Jones last week, where they didn't even really need Aaron Jones. Jamal Williams just filled in just fine for him, but obviously Aaron Jones is one of the best running backs in football. At $7,300 versus a very poor Minnesota Vikings defense, especially versus the run, I think Aaron Jones should firmly be in play this week and can definitely have a case made for him being in the top RB play on this slate, assuming he's fully good to go, which it sounded like he wanted to play and insisted to play, but the Green Bay Packers medical staff just wasn't going to let it go, which they really didn't need him last week anyway. But Jones, looking at his numbers this season, the thing that makes him pretty valuable is he's kind of like an Alvin Kamara light, like around 6 targets per game this season, only 32 receiving yards, but a 17% target share. Not quite Alvin Kamara, but he's got similar traits to Kamara, where he's great on the ground, he's also very good through the air as well, and around 80 rushing yards per game, 15 rushing attempts per game, a rushing touchdown per game, very efficient with his touches. Good matchup versus Minnesota, 28th DVA versus the run, allowing 25.2 DraftKings points per game to the running back position. So yeah, good spot for Aaron Jones, and I like him quite a bit. But I will say, my favorite running back on the slate right now is Kareem Hunt at $6,900. The Vegas Raiders have been awful versus running backs, and Kareem Hunt, he's one of the most talented running backs in the NFL. They have a 28-point implied team total. He's going to be involved in the passing game too. There's no Nick Chubb, so he's going to get all the work here. And I see no reason not to just jam in Kareem Hunt at $6,900. I think he should be a little bit more expensive than this. And this is a dream matchup versus the Raiders. They're 29th DVA versus the run, allowing over 32 DraftKings points per game, which is the third most in the league. A lot of rushing touchdowns. They're getting killed through the air, 7 catches per game, 63 receiving yards per game. So yeah, Kareem Hunt, I like him a ton. Pretty much my favorite running back play on the slate. One of my favorite plays on the slate as well. Jonathan Taylor, $6,600. He has not been the guy we thought he was going to be. I was expecting kind of like fireworks from Jonathan Taylor behind this offensive line ever since he took over. Hasn't really been the case. He's had some solid games, but definitely hasn't taken over the world for sure. But this is a pretty good matchup versus Detroit. And this game has a 50-point over-under, which is pretty good. They're 2-point favorites on the road, 26.25 implied team total for the Indianapolis Colts. You know he's going to get the volume each and every single week. They're 23rd DVA versus the run, allowing over 110 rushing yards per game, 27th in points allowed per game to running back position. So yeah, good spot for Jonathan Taylor. He just doesn't feel as splashy of a play, but I think he'll be solid for you. Then Josh Jacobs, $6,200. I prefer using Derek Carr in the passing game here, but I could see a scenario where you can end up playing both. Now, the Browns have been a little bit better versus the run than they have versus the pass, but this is still a beatable defense in all aspects. They're 19th DVA versus the run, allowing 23.9 DraftKings points per game position, which is actually 13th, and only 69 rushing yards per game. With Josh Jacobs, he's a very talented running back. He's been involved in the passing game so far this season with an 11% target share, and I like that price point quite a bit. I have a hard time seeing him not find the end zone, so Josh Jacobs at $6,200, he is firmly in play for me. And as of right now, there's not really any cheap running backs that stand out to me. I'll have to find one for when I do my cheap value plays video later on in the week. But as of right now, I'm kind of liking these mid-range and higher up running backs because I'm probably going to spend down for the quarterback position. So I should have enough money to be able to spend up for running backs this week and maybe a wide receiver or two as well. And now we'll move on to the wide receiver position, which there's a lot of good wide receiver plays this week. I mean, up top, the obvious is Davante Adams, but that's a massive price tag at $800. Last week when Aaron Jones was ruled out, it was pretty easy just to plug in Davante Adams versus Houston at less than an $8K price tag. Now at nearly $9,000, you're probably only getting here in tournaments because I'd rather spend it for a running back this week than I would a wide receiver. So I think there's plenty of good mid-range and value plays this week at the position, but it's a great spot versus Minnesota. We know what the upside Adams has. He showed it last week with nearly 50 DraftKings points. Has a 34% target share this season, 11 targets per game. I mean, you guys get the idea. Davante Adams is very good at what he does. And the Vikings are allowing the third most points per game to the wide receiver position and 2 receiving touchdowns per game. So Adams, I think he has a very strong game. It's just a matter of being able to fit him in your lineups because it's a lot of money to pay for him. On the flip side of this game, we have Adam Thielen at $7,200. He's also having a very, very excellent season, with them being 7-point dogs on the road. I would expect the Vikings having to throw the ball a little bit more than they'd like to. But, I mean, Thielen's been great this season, and he actually had a really good game versus the Green Bay Packers early on in the season, where he ended up scoring twice. And $7,200 is a lot easier to fit in than $8,800, that's for sure. But his numbers this season are very good. A 42% market share of the team's air yards, 700 air yards on the season, and 8 out of 14.1 over receiving touchdown per game, 8 targets per game. and just overall some very strong numbers. Now, the Packers have been pretty good versus wide receivers this season, but the volume alone and the talent alone from Adam Thielen is what's going to get me there, and I like it as a game stack. It's not an easy game to stack because if you want to use Aaron Jones, Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, Adam Thielen, Dalvin Cook, that is a lot of money, and you're going to have to definitely find some value plays, but it's definitely a good game to stack with their 54.5 point over-under. A.J. Brown, nearly $7,000 now. I miss the days when he was below 6K, but man, I think it's deserved. A.J. Brown's awesome. He's huge, he's fast, he runs good routes, and he's been very good for fantasy purposes for quite some time now, so this is definitely deserved. It's also a very good spot versus the Cincinnati Bengals. And if you're looking at his numbers this season, over 7 targets per game, a 32% market share of the team's air yards, a 23% target share. It's a good matchup versus Cincinnati. Now, they're mid-pack versus wide receivers, but they're still 26 DVA versus the pass. And we saw the Cleveland Browns wide receivers last week all have pretty much good games for the most part. So A.J. Brown is definitely a viable option if you're using Ryan Tannehill. Tyreek Hill, $6,700. Again, probably more of a tournament play because I could see the Chiefs absolutely murdering the New York Jets, and they probably don't have to go use a whole bunch of deep bombs to Tyreek Hill. So that'd be the only concern there, but I mean, it's a great spot versus the Jets. They're pretty much one of the worst, if not the worst team in football. With 7 targets per game right now. We know there's upside on deep routes, 36% market share of the team's air yards, 8 out of 13.4 this season. It's Tyreek Hill versus the Jets. Yes, he's a good play. It's just a matter of being able to afford him, and if you're just a little bit scared of a potential blowout, which is probably not potential, it's probably just going to happen. But it's a good spot versus the Jets. One of my favorite plays this week, and I feel like he's probably a cash game lock right now. I mean, it's very early on the week, so I hate to say that on a Tuesday, but I don't see how we don't play Keenan Allen at only $6,200. That's what his price was last week, and I don't see how you just don't play it again. Like, he's a super talented wide receiver, and Justin Herbert, he's playing like one of the best quarterbacks in football right now. He's not playing like a rookie. The guy looks like the real deal. He's an absolute stud, and he is playing awesome. And Keenan Allen is his number one target. We know the volume's going to be there with Keenan Allen each and every single week. I mean, we saw a game, I think it was week 3, where he had 19 targets. He saw double-digit targets last week, was over 100 yards. Did not get into the end zone, but he had a very, very good game. And this price tag is just kind of silly to me. He's getting 10 targets per game, a 31% target share. Not only, but a 30% market share of the team's air yards, but an 8 out of 8.7. But I don't know how you don't play Keenan Allen here. And don't forget, he left the game early versus the Saints, which is going to skew these numbers down a little bit because it doesn't count as a full game for PFF purposes. So, I mean, Keenan Allen's numbers are even better than that on a per game basis if you take out the New Orleans game. So, yeah, I don't see how we don't play Keenan Allen here. It's a good matchup versus the Denver Broncos. Now, they're only 9th DVA versus the pass, but they're bottom half in the league versus the wide receiver position, nearly 40 points per game given up, and that's 19th in the league. So Keenan Allen, love the spot here. Not a super high Vegas over-under here of 45.5 and only a 3-point spread, but Justin Herbert's been awesome, and Keenan Allen has as well. So love Keenan Allen here for sure. And Brandon Ayuk, $5,800. He had quite a bit of targets last week, and it's looking like new Deebo Samuel. And we got to play wide receivers versus Seattle pretty much each and every single week. They are horrendous versus opposing wide receivers this season. And just every single week, I'm like, they can't be this bad versus wide receivers. And then, like, I know they're going to have wide receivers are typically going to have pretty good games versus Seattle, but you'd think it'd tone down a little bit. But it's just not toning down. They're getting slaughtered by the wide receiver position every single week. So definitely got to buy into this. They're giving up 64.3 DraftKings points per game to the position, which is dead last in the league. Nearly 300 receiving yards per game, and they're 30th DVA versus the pass. So Ayuk, pretty talented wide receiver, and I think he's going to have a pretty solid game here, especially with no Deebo Samuel. The targets are going to be safe, and good spot versus Seattle, pretty much as good as it can get. So definitely like Ayuk. T. Higgins, $5,600. He's been very good ever since he got thrusted into the starting lineup. Like, ever since week 3 for T. Higgins, he's been at 21, 13, 10, 21, and 18 points. The targets are there pretty much each and every single week for him. So, yeah, T. Higgins liked quite a bit, and I like this game stack with Joe Burrow, so definitely a fan of T. Higgins. Jarvis Landry, $5,600. This is mainly just getting exposure to this Cleveland-Las Vegas game. Even with Odell Beckham Jr. being out, Landry didn't have a huge game, but at $5,600, you'd obviously expect a uptick in usage here, and I think the ball is going to be spread around quite a bit. I think Harrison Bryant, David Njoku, Rashard Higgins, even Peoples-Jones, and Jarvis Landry, they're all going to be involved, but it's a good spot here versus Las Vegas. They struggle pretty much in all aspects on defense. If you look at their numbers versus wide receivers, they're 29th DVA versus the pass, and they're 22nd versus the wide receiver position, and Landry's got a pretty big wide receiver versus quarterback matchup advantage this week per PFF, so definitely a fan of him at $5,600, but I wouldn't expect him to get double-digit targets here versus Las Vegas because, again, I do expect Baker to be able to spread the ball around quite a bit. But Landry is their most talented wide receiver for sure, although he's playing a bit banged up. AJ Green, $4,500. He is getting a ton of targets pretty much each and every single week. Well, maybe I shouldn't say each and every single week, but for the majority of the season, he has been seeing quite a bit of targets. He had 9 in week 1, 13 in week 2, a bit of a rough stretch there, but then 11 targets and 13 targets the past couple of weeks, and he's putting up some pretty solid fantasy outings, especially given his price tag. And I'm a fan once again here. It's a good matchup versus Tennessee. They have struggled versus wide receivers so far this season. I think I already talked about this with T. Higgins, but they're actually allowing the 4th most points per game to the position, and their 19th DVA versus the pass, and he's a pretty easy pairing with Joe Burrow. And with them being 6-point dogs on the road, I would expect them to be throwing the ball quite a bit. So AJ Green, I think he's a pretty solid play. Rashard Higgins, 4,200. If you guys don't know anything about Rashard Higgins, he's been on the Browns for quite some time, and he actually has some very good chemistry with Baker Mayfield. I think that's a big reason that he actually re-signed with the Browns, just to play with Baker. I mean, they're pretty good friends, and they've got good chemistry, and Higgins had a very good game last week once Odell went out, and he played around 85% of the snaps, so we know he's going to be on the field for sure. And he caught all 6 of his targets for over 100 yards, and this is a good matchup versus the Las Vegas Raiders, so I'm a fan of Higgins. You could even use Peoples-Jones as a tournament flyer for sure. And Hunter Renfrow, this is just on the flip side of that game. He's only $3,800. He's not a huge upside kind of guy, but I feel like he's a safe play at $3,800, especially versus this Cleveland defense. I mean, they're just pretty bad versus the pass. They're actually allowing the 2nd most points per game to the wide receiver position, only behind the Seattle Seahawks. 50 DraftKings points per game and 25th DVA versus the pass. So Hunter Renfrow at only $3,800. He'd be a fine pairing with Derek Carr. And you also have Darnell Mooney here at $3,500. Now, Allen Robinson, he did leave the game late because he got hit in the head. I don't remember if they gave an official word on if he actually had a concussion or not. I know he's getting evaluated for one, but I have not seen an official report on that yet. But I'm hoping Robinson plays because I would assume Marshall Lattimore is going to follow him around all game, and that means it's going to be softer coverage for Darnell Mooney here. And he had around 7 targets last week, and he actually hasn't been horrendous once you factor in his price tag. He's gotten 8 out of 14.4 this season, around 5 targets per game, which only equates to a 13% target share. But at only $3,500, I think it's fine, especially in what should be a pretty pass-heavy game script versus the New Orleans Saints. This is also a pass funnel defense, not saying they're like suck versus the pass, but it's very, very hard to run on the Saints, and I can't expect David Montgomery's going to do too much here, and they're going to be trailing. So Mooney, I think he's in a nice sneaky spot here, especially if Allen Robinson happens to play. If he doesn't play, it's going to be tougher coverage on Mooney, but I guess it'd be better from a volume standpoint, but I am kind of hoping Allen Robinson does play here. Then we'll move on to the tight end position. And then you have your obvious spend-ups in George Kittle and Travis Kelce. Both are in some pretty good matchups. Seattle is just such a bad pass defense. And George Kittle's numbers this season, obviously he's going to get the majority of the looks on that team. 9 targets per game, 27% target share, 60% weighted opportunity share, nearly 30% of the team's market share of the team's air yards, which is kind of sad with a 6.5 ADOT. But net receiving yards per game. We know the upside with George Kittle. Good matchup versus Seattle. He's definitely in play, but I got to be honest, I'm not one that really likes to spend up for the tight end position much. Travis Kelce, $6,600. Great matchup versus the Jets, but again, I do have concerns with them keeping this game close. And if they don't keep it close, we could see something similar last week where Travis Kelce did not have that great of a game. Neither did Patrick Mahomes. But, I mean, if they score 30 points and they take Patrick Mahomes out, I would assume Kelce probably got into the end zone once or twice. I mean, obviously, the guy's one of the best tight ends in football, averaging nearly a touchdown per game. He's got an 8 out of 7.2, 22% market share of the team's air yards, nearly 8 targets per game. So, yeah, it's a good spot versus the Jets. It's just that 20-point spread does scare me a little bit for sure. But Darren Waller, I love Darren Waller this week. And if I got the money for him, I would love to spend up for him. And I just feel like the more I talk about this, I feel like my main lineup is going to be a lot of Vegas and Browns players because I say Vegas and Browns, Raiders and Browns. Raiders and Browns players because this is a great game to stack. It's a tight spread. It's a high over-under. 2 pretty bad defenses versus the run and versus the pass. And Darren Waller, he's one of the highest targeted tight ends in the entire league, nearly 9 targets per game, a 56% weighted opportunity share, and just overall some very strong numbers. And also the Browns aren't that good versus tight ends. They're allowing 14.4 DraftKings points per game to the position, which is 21st in the league. And we know this is a poor pass defense. So Waller, big fan of him this week, and he's very easy to pair with Derek Carr. And really, he's just my favorite person to pair with Derek Carr as well. Then Hunter Henry, $4,200. Justin Herbert went absolutely off last week. Henry still got targets, but he did not have a great game, which was kind of weird. You would have thought Hunter Henry would have at least had a pretty solid game with Justin Herbert scoring over 40 DraftKings points. But it was kind of like a lot of these, I wouldn't say no-name guys. We know who they are. It's just they weren't the guys you really expected to score. We thought Keenan Allen would get into the end zone. We thought Hunter Henry would get in the end zone, but unfortunately that was not the case. But Henry, I like him here versus Denver. It's more of a mid-pack matchup versus Denver when it comes to tight ends, but he's going to get targets every single week. He's got an 8 out of 8.1, and his quarterback is just absolutely on fire. So yeah, Henry at $4,200 is certainly in play. Jonnu Smith, he didn't really do much at all last week, but this is a good spot versus Cincinnati. They just got absolutely torched by tight ends last week by the Cleveland Browns, and it wasn't even their starting tight ends. It was Harrison Bryant and David Njoku. They had no answers for them, so Jonnu Smith, he should probably have a decent game here. I expect him to bounce back quite a bit, and only $4,100. I think it's definitely a good buy low spot there for Jonnu Smith. The Bengals just are not that good versus tight ends. If we're looking at their official numbers, they are 29th versus them, allowing nearly 20 DraftKings points per game, nearly receiving touchdown per game, and 70 receiving yards. So I definitely like the spot for Jonnu Smith. Trey Burton at $3,500. He's coming for a really good game before the bye week where he had 2 touchdowns. Now, one of them actually came off a rushing touchdown, so we can't expect that every week. But he's definitely been the preferred tight end in this offense ever since he got activated, and I think that's probably going to continue here. And it's actually a pretty good spot versus Detroit. They do not have that great of a defense, and they have a decently high team total at 26.25. So Burton, he is certainly in play for me, and at only $3,500, I think that's a pretty good point per dollar option. Then Harrison Bryant, I'm assuming Austin Hooper is not going to be back, and this guy's pretty good. I was telling you last week at $2,500, I originally put Austin Hooper in my favorite value play tight end of the week. And I feel pretty good about that because I feel like if he did play, it would have been a really good game for him considering Bryant and Njoku combined for 3 touchdowns. But I like this Bryant guy. He was a good pass-catching tight end in college, and the guy looked pretty good in the field. I'm not even sure if they need Austin Hooper. I mean, I think the Browns would be just fine with Harrison Bryant. The guy looked pretty good. But assuming that Austin Hooper is out at $3,200, it's a great spot here versus the Raiders. He was targeted last week quite a bit. He was on the field for the majority of the game. He outsnapped David Njoku. And the Raiders, they're kind of just mid-range versus tight ends, but overall, it's a good spot for Harrison Bryant. And Baker Mayfield does like the tight end position, so at $3,200, assuming Hooper is out, he is certainly viable for me. Then as for the defenses, I have them all listed here still. You're pretty much just picking favorites for the most part. The Chiefs, they're 20-point favorites versus the Jets. They had a huge game last week. They're super expensive, but I mean, if you got the money for them, sure, go for it. But I'm not really someone that likes to spend all the way up for the defense position. But yeah, for the most part, I'm just trying to pick people that are teams that are favored or that are just playing at home or they're decently priced. Like the Packers, they're only $2,900. They're playing at home versus Minnesota, and Kirk Cousins can certainly make some mistakes. Now, assuming Dalvin Cook's back, they're probably going to have a hard time stopping them. But they're 7-point favorites here, 24-point implied team total against them. I think the Packers are all right there. The Browns, they're $2,600. Not that great of a defense, but they are playing at home, and I mean, they have Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward, and that might be decent enough just for $2,600. And they are 2.5-point favorites, but even then, I do like Derek Carr and a couple of the other Raiders. So I'm not really sure if I'd love to go with the Browns. The Browns are out, but I'm not going to spend too much time on defense here. We'll figure that out later on in the week. And it's mainly just trying to fit a team that fits at the end. I don't really try to spend too much time on defenses. Last week, we got a layup play in the Washington football team. That was pretty much just one of the easiest plays of the week, especially going up against Andy Dalton and with some of their linemen being out. Not sure if we're going to have that easy of a defense this week, but I mean, we'll figure that out later on in the week. But I hope this video was helpful, guys. If it was, make sure you leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to get out of here. And I think tomorrow we can expect the studs video. And I'll probably get out the showdown video as well. So I appreciate you watching. And I'll see you guys in the next one.